Gatlinburg, Tennessee, June 1987, a mountain town nestled in the Smoky Mountains where summer brought tourists and church groups, where hiking trails wound through forests, and where families felt safe sending their children on weekend retreats with youth pastors they trusted. Melissa Parker lived in Knoxville with her parents Carol and Richard, and her younger brother Brian, who was 10, and Melissa was 13 years old with curly black hair, brown eyes, and a gentle spirit that drew people to her. She attended Riverside Baptist Church, where she had been baptized at age 8, sang in the youth choir, and participated enthusiastically in the youth group led by Assistant Pastor David Brennan, who organized monthly activities and summer retreats. In early June, Pastor Brennan announced a weekend camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 3 days of hiking, campfire worship, and team-building activities, and 23 teenagers signed up, including Melissa. Carol helped Melissa pack on Friday morning, June 12th, filling her backpack with clothes, toiletries, and supplies, and Melissa wore her bright yellow youth group t-shirt that said, "Riverside Youth, Faith in Action," across the front. The group departed from the church parking lot at 9 in the morning, in 2 vans driven by Pastor Brennan and another church volunteer named Margaret Hayes, and parents waved goodbye, trusting their children would be safe with church leaders. They arrived at the campground near Cades Cove around 11, and the group set up tents in a designated area with girls on one side and boys on the other, and after lunch they hiked the Laurel Falls Trail together. Melissa walked with her friend Amanda Turner and several other girls, taking photographs with her disposable camera, laughing and talking about school and summer plans, and Pastor Brennan walked at the back, ensuring no one fell behind. That evening they gathered around a campfire for worship, singing hymns and sharing testimonies about their faith. And Melissa spoke about feeling called to mission work, about wanting to help children in underserved communities. Saturday morning began with breakfast cooked over camping stoves, and Pastor Brennan announced they would hike to Abrams Falls, a more challenging 5-mile round-trip trail, and everyone filled their water bottles before departing at 9:30. The group started together but quickly spread out along the trail, with faster hikers pulling ahead and slower ones lagging behind, and Melissa was somewhere in the middle with Amanda and 2 other girls. Around 10:45, Amanda realized Melissa was no longer with their group, and she asked the other girls if anyone had seen her, but no one had noticed when Melissa had dropped back from the group. After 5 minutes with no sign of Melissa, Amanda walked back down the trail calling her name, and she found Melissa's water bottle lying on the ground near a bend in the path, but Melissa herself was nowhere visible. Amanda ran back to find Pastor Brennan, who was checking on stragglers further up the trail, and she told him Melissa was missing, and Brennan immediately called the group to stop and organize searchers to look for her. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. Teenagers spread out calling Melissa's name, checking side trails and rocky areas, and Pastor Brennan radioed park rangers for assistance, and within 30 minutes rangers arrived with additional personnel to coordinate a systematic search. The search expanded quickly, with volunteers checking dense vegetation and steep terrain, but after 2 hours of searching, there was no sign of Melissa, except the water bottle Amanda had found near the trail. Park rangers contacted the Sevier County Sheriff's Department, and deputies arrived to take statements from every member of the youth group, asking when Melissa was last seen, what she was wearing, if she seemed upset. Amanda described how Melissa had been walking behind her and then was gone, how the group had spread out, making it easy for someone to fall behind without being noticed, and she blamed herself for not watching more carefully. Pastor Brennan told investigators that Melissa was a responsible girl who would not wander off intentionally, and he said the youth group had done this hike before without incident, and he had been checking on everyone regularly throughout the morning. Search dogs were brought in, and they picked up Melissa's scent from the water bottle, following it down the trail for about 50 yards before losing it near a rocky outcropping, and the handlers said the scent disappeared suddenly. Investigators began to consider that someone might have taken Melissa, that this was not a case of a lost hiker but a potential abduction, and that realization changed the entire approach to the investigation. The campground was secured with no one allowed to leave, and investigators interviewed all 23 teenagers and the adult chaperones individually, documenting where everyone had been and who had seen Melissa last. By nightfall, the search had expanded to include helicopter thermal imaging, additional search and rescue teams, and volunteers from nearby communities, and Carol and Richard Parker arrived after being notified by church officials. They stood at the trailhead holding each other while searchers called Melissa's name through the darkening forest, and Carol kept asking how this could happen, how her daughter could vanish on a church trip with trusted leaders. The search continued through Sunday with hundreds of volunteers combing the forest, checking caves and ravines, following every possible path Melissa might have taken, but no trace of her was found beyond the water bottle. Detective James Crawford from the Sevier County Sheriff's Department took lead on the investigation, and he was 48 years old with 25 years of experience, and he interviewed Pastor Brennan extensively about the trip planning. Brennan was cooperative and visibly distraught, saying he felt responsible for Melissa's safety, that her parents had trusted him to protect their daughter, and he could not understand how this had happened. The youth group returned to Knoxville on Monday, with investigators having documented everyone's belongings and taken DNA samples from all participants for elimination purposes, and the teenagers were traumatized and unable to comprehend what had happened. Melissa's bright yellow youth group shirt was not found among her belongings at the campsite, and initially investigators assumed she'd been wearing it when she disappeared. But Amanda said Melissa had changed into a blue tank top Saturday morning. The yellow shirt had gotten dirty Friday night around the campfire, and Melissa had hung it outside her tent to air out, and Amanda remembered seeing it there Saturday morning but could not recall what happened to it after that. The missing shirt became a point of interest, and investigators searched the campground thoroughly looking for it, checking trash bins, searching the vans, interviewing everyone about when they had last seen it, but the shirt was never found. Weeks turned into months with the investigation producing no solid leads, and Melissa's case dominated Tennessee news with her school photo appearing on missing person posters throughout the state, and tips came in regularly, but none led anywhere. Detective Crawford interviewed everyone connected to the church youth group multiple times, looking for inconsistencies or overlooked information, and he investigated Pastor Brennan's background thoroughly, checking for any complaints or concerning behavior. Brennan had been with Riverside Baptist Church for 8 years, was married with 3 children, and had an impeccable reputation as a youth leader who genuinely cared about teenagers, and dozens of parents vouched for his character. The church community rallied around the Parker family, organizing prayer vigils, providing meals, offering support, and Carol and Richard attended every vigil hoping that collective prayer would bring their daughter home. Brian struggled with his sister's disappearance, experiencing nightmares and anxiety, and he blamed himself irrationally for not being on the camping trip, thinking somehow he could have protected Melissa if he had been there. The case went cold by the end of 1987, not because investigators gave up, but because there were no more leads to follow, no witnesses, no evidence beyond the water bottle. Carol Parker kept Melissa's bedroom exactly as it had been, with posters on the walls, books on the shelves, and clothes in the closet, and she would sit in there for hours talking to Melissa, praying for her safe return. Richard threw himself into work, taking extra shifts at the manufacturing plant where he was a supervisor, because staying busy was easier than sitting home thinking about Melissa, and he and Carol grew distant as their grief manifested differently. Years passed and Melissa's case became one of many unsolved missing person cases in Tennessee, occasionally mentioned in cold case reviews, but never generating new leads, and the Parker family learned to live with the permanent absence of answers. Detective Crawford retired in 2003 after 38 years in law enforcement, and Melissa's case haunted him, the one he had never solved, the family he had never been able to give closure, and he kept her file at home. In 2010, the case was assigned to Detective Lauren Mitchell, who was 34 and specialized in cold cases involving missing children, and she reviewed the file multiple times, studying the witness statements and search reports. Mitchell noticed something in the original evidence inventory, a notation that several items of clothing from the campsite had been collected and stored, but never fully processed for DNA, because the technology in 1987 was limited and expensive. She requested that all stored evidence be sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab for analysis using modern DNA technology, hoping that touch DNA or other genetic material might have been preserved on the fabric. The lab processed everything carefully, extracting DNA from multiple items including sleeping bags, towels, and several t-shirts that had been collected from the campground, and most profiles matched known individuals who had been eliminated as suspects. But one t-shirt yielded an interesting result that made Mitchell pause and reread the report. The shirt was a yellow Riverside Youth Group shirt with "Faith in Action" printed on the front, found in the church van during the return trip wedged under a seat. The DNA extracted from the shirt belonged to Melissa Parker, based on skin cells and hair found on the collar and inside the fabric, confirming it was the shirt she had been wearing. But there was also male DNA found on the sleeves and back. The male DNA was touch DNA from someone who had grabbed or held the shirt, and the placement and concentration suggested more than casual contact. The forensic report indicated it was consistent with someone grabbing the shirt from behind or holding someone wearing it. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them. So if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. Mitchell ran the unknown male DNA profile through CODIS hoping for a match, and after 3 weeks the system returned a result that made her heart race. A partial match strong enough to warrant investigation. The profile belonged to David Brennan, the assistant pastor who had led the camping trip, and Mitchell sat at her desk trying to understand why Brennan's DNA would be on Melissa's shirt in a pattern suggesting he had grabbed it. Brennan had been cooperative during the original investigation, had provided DNA for elimination purposes, had seemed genuinely devastated by Melissa's disappearance, and his DNA being on her shirt was not necessarily suspicious since he was the trip leader. But the placement troubled Mitchell. The forensic report indicated the DNA was on the upper back and sleeves of the shirt, consistent with someone grabbing from behind, and that pattern suggested something more than a youth pastor helping with gear. Mitchell began investigating Brennan's background more thoroughly than the original investigation had done, and she discovered that Brennan had left Riverside Baptist Church in 1991, 4 years after Melissa's disappearance, officially citing family reasons. She contacted the church where Brennan had gone next, a small congregation in Chattanooga, and learned that he had left that position after only 2 years following complaints from parents about him spending too much individual time with teenage girls. The concerns were never formally documented but led to his quiet departure, and Mitchell found this pattern repeated at 3 more churches between 1993 and 2005, staying at each for only a few years before moving on. In 2006, Brennan had been arrested in Nashville for following a teenage girl from a coffee shop to her car and attempting to engage her in conversation despite her clear discomfort and requests to be left alone. He had been charged with misdemeanor harassment, pleaded guilty and received probation, and that arrest had required DNA submission, which entered Brennan into the system, and now that DNA matched the profile on Melissa's shirt. Mitchell had enough to bring Brennan in for questioning, and she obtained a warrant and drove to his current address in Franklin, Tennessee, about 30 miles south of Nashville, where he had been living alone since his retirement from ministry. Brennan was now 68 years old, gray-haired and slight, living in a modest apartment in a quiet complex, and when Mitchell knocked on his door, he answered wearing reading glasses and a cardigan, looking like someone's harmless grandfather. His expression shifted when she showed her badge and said she needed to talk about Melissa Parker, and for a moment he seemed to consider closing the door, but then he stepped aside and invited her in, saying he had wondered when someone would come. Mitchell sat across from him in his small living room and explained that new DNA evidence had been found on Melissa's youth group shirt, and Brennan's DNA was on that shirt in a pattern suggesting he had grabbed it or held it forcefully. Brennan was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded in his lap, and then he said he had carried the weight for 36 years, that he had prayed for forgiveness, but knew he deserved punishment, and he was ready to tell the truth. Mitchell activated her recording device and read Brennan his rights, and he waived his right to an attorney saying he wanted to confess, that keeping the secret had been destroying him slowly, and it was time to face what he had done. He said he had been attracted to Melissa in a way that shamed him deeply, that he had rationalized it as pastoral concern, but knew it was something darker, something he had struggled with throughout his ministry, but never acted on until that camping trip. He said on Saturday morning when the group was hiking to Abrams Falls, he had deliberately hung back, had watched Melissa fall behind her friends, and when she stopped to retie her shoe, He had approached her saying the others were getting too far ahead. Melissa had seemed uncomfortable but had been too polite to refuse his company, and they had walked together for several minutes with Brennan making conversation about her faith and missionary aspirations, and then he had touched her shoulder inappropriately. She had pulled away immediately and told him to stop, told him she was going to tell her parents what he had done, and Brennan had panicked because he could not afford another situation, another whispered conversation that would end his ministry. He had grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth to keep her from screaming, had pulled her off the trail into the dense forest, dragging her despite her struggling, and Melissa had fought hard, had tried to bite his hand, had kicked and twisted trying to escape. In his panic to silence her and his fear of being caught, he had pressed his hand too hard over her nose and mouth, had not released his grip even when she stopped fighting, and by the time he realized what he had done, she was not breathing. Brennan said he had laid her on the ground and checked for a pulse but found nothing, had tried to revive her but she was gone, and he had killed her without meaning to, had let his fear override everything he claimed to believe about protecting children. He had carried her body deeper into the woods, away from the trail, to a steep ravine that would be difficult to search, and he had covered her with leaves and branches, and then he had noticed her yellow shirt had torn during the struggle. The shirt was distinctive and might be found, so he had taken it with him, had stuffed it in his backpack intending to destroy it later, but in the chaos of organizing the search and dealing with investigators, he had forgotten about it until days later. By then the van had been searched and the shirt discovered under a seat where it had fallen from his bag, but investigators assumed it belonged to one of the teenagers and had been left behind accidentally, and no one connected it to Melissa's disappearance. Brennan had returned to the group and organized the search, had acted concerned and devastated, and when investigators questioned him, he had lied about his whereabouts, had said he was checking on teenagers throughout the morning, and his alibi could not be fully verified. He had gotten away with it, had continued working with youth groups for years afterward, had moved from church to church whenever questions arose, and he had told himself Melissa's death was an accident, even though he knew he was responsible. Mitchell asked where Melissa's body was located, and Brennan described the ravine in detail. Approximately 100 yards east of the Abrams Falls Trail near mile marker 2, steep terrain covered with dense vegetation that had not been thoroughly searched initially. Detective Mitchell arrested Brennan immediately, reading him his rights formally and transporting him to the Sevier County Sheriff's Department, and she organized a search and recovery team to locate Melissa's remains based on the location Brennan had described. The team deployed to the Abrams Falls Trail area the following morning with ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and forensic specialists, and the ravine was steep and overgrown with vegetation that had grown thick and wild over 36 years. The dogs alerted to a spot approximately 90 yards from the trail, deeper into the terrain than initial searches had covered, and the team began excavating carefully, removing layers of decomposed leaves, soil, and roots that had grown through the earth. 4 feet down, they found fabric fragments that had somehow survived decades of decomposition, and beneath that were bones, small and fragile, the skeletal remains of a child who had been buried in the forest for more than 3 decades. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office in Nashville, and forensic analysis confirmed through dental records and bone structure that they belonged to Melissa Parker, and she had been there all along, less than a quarter mile from where she disappeared. Detective Mitchell called Carol and Richard Parker, who were now in their 70s, living in the same house in Knoxville where they had raised their children, and she told them Melissa had been found, told them she was finally coming home. Carol made a sound that was wordless and broken, the culmination of 36 years of not knowing, of praying and hoping and imagining scenarios where Melissa was still alive somewhere, and that hope was now definitively gone, replaced with the terrible certainty of death. Richard asked if she had suffered, and Mitchell said based on Brennan's confession it had been quick, that Melissa had fought but had not been held captive or tortured, and while that provided little comfort, it was some small mercy in a merciless situation. Brian flew home from Atlanta where he was living with his wife and 3 children, and he was now 46 years old, a successful architect, but still the 10-year-old boy who had lost his sister and never stopped wondering what happened to her. The 3 of them sat together in the living room where Melissa's high school graduation photo still hung on the wall, where her presence had never faded despite her absence, and they cried together for the first time in years, finally able to grieve properly. 20 years later, One overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. The funeral was held in December 2023, 36 years after Melissa disappeared, at Riverside Baptist Church, which had changed leadership multiple times, but remained the spiritual home of the Parker family despite everything that had happened there. The current pastor, Reverend Coleman, had not been at the church in 1987 but had heard Melissa's story from longtime members, and he spoke about betrayal, about evil hiding behind positions of trust, about the courage to seek truth, even when it takes decades. The sanctuary was full of people who had known Melissa, who had searched for her in those early days, who had attended prayer vigils year after year, and also younger church members who had only heard her story but felt compelled to honor her memory. The casket was small and white, covered in pink roses because pink had been Melissa's favorite color, and Carol sat in the front pew holding Richard's hand, staring at the casket and thinking about all the moments they had missed, all the life Melissa never got to live. She thought about graduations and weddings and grandchildren, about the journalist Melissa might have become, about the mission work she had dreamed of doing, and all of it had been stolen by a man who claimed to serve God while preying on children. After the service, they drove to Highland South Memorial Park, where a plot had been prepared on a hillside with a view of the Smoky Mountains that Melissa had loved, and the headstone was gray granite with her name and dates and the inscription, "Forever 13, beloved daughter and sister." They stood together at the grave, the three remaining members of a family that should have been four, and they placed flowers and photographs, and Brian read a poem he had written about missing his sister, about carrying her memory through his entire adult life. David Brennan was charged with second-degree murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a position of trust, and his attorney, a public defender named Robert Mills, reviewed the evidence and told Brennan he should plead not guilty, argue the death was accidental. But Brennan refused that advice, saying he had lived with the lie for 36 years and could not continue, that the Parker family deserved truth and acknowledgement, and in February 2024 he entered a guilty plea to all charges. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing, and Carol, Richard, and Brian sat in the front row, and Brennan stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit looking diminished and old, no longer the confident youth pastor who had inspired trust. For the first time since his arrest, he turned to look at the Parker family directly, and Carol stared back without blinking, her face showing decades of grief and anger, and Brennan opened his mouth as if to speak but then closed it, understanding no words could matter. The judge asked if Carol wanted to make a victim impact statement, and she stood slowly, walking to the podium with a piece of paper in her trembling hands, and she spoke clearly despite the tears that ran down her face. She said Brennan had not just taken Melissa's life, he had stolen 36 years from their family, 36 years of not knowing if her daughter was alive, if she was suffering, if she would ever come home, and that torture had been worse than death. She said Brennan had hidden behind his position as a spiritual leader, had used their trust to gain access to their daughter, had betrayed everything he claimed to represent, and she hoped he would spend every remaining day of his life thinking about what he had done. She said Melissa had been kind and faithful and full of dreams, had wanted to help people and serve God, and Brennan had destroyed all of that because he could not control his own darkness, and the world was poorer for losing what Melissa might have become. The judge sentenced Brennan to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and as he was led away in handcuffs and chains, Carol felt Richard's arm around her shoulders, and they walked out of the courtroom together into the February cold. The days after the sentencing were strange and hollow. The question that had defined their lives for 36 years was finally answered, but the answer brought no peace, only confirmation of what they had feared, that Melissa had been taken by someone they trusted. Richard returned to his routine but found himself crying at unexpected moments, while working in the garage or watching television. The grief he had held back for decades finally released now that he knew the truth, now that there was nothing left to hope for. Carol visited Melissa's grave several times a week, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby, talking to her daughter about everything and nothing, and she found some comfort in knowing exactly where Melissa was, in being able to visit her. Brian struggled with anger he had not expected, rage at Brennan for taking his sister, at the church for not seeing the warning signs, at God for allowing it to happen. and he worked through these feelings with a therapist who specialized in trauma. He had children of his own now, 2 daughters and a son, and the idea of someone harming them the way Brennan had harmed Melissa made him physically sick, and he became overprotective, struggled to trust youth leaders and coaches and anyone in authority. The yellow shirt that had preserved Brennan's DNA remained in the evidence room at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, stored in a climate-controlled facility as part of the permanent case file, and it became a teaching tool for forensic students learning about touch DNA. Instructors used Melissa's case to demonstrate how DNA could survive on fabric for decades if properly stored, how seemingly insignificant evidence could become crucial with advancing technology, and how persistence in re-examining old cases could bring justice. Detective Mitchell continued working cold cases, and Melissa's case became her most significant achievement, not because it was the most complex, but because it demonstrated the importance of using modern technology to reanalyze evidence that had been collected before DNA analysis was widely available. She trained other detectives using Melissa's case as a primary example, showing them the original evidence inventory from 1987, the yellow shirt that had been stored but not tested, and the DNA results that had finally identified her killer after 36 years. The church community struggled with the revelation that a trusted pastor had killed one of their children, and Riverside Baptist Church underwent significant changes in their youth protection policies, implementing background checks, 2 adult rules for all activities, and training for recognizing grooming behavior. They established the Melissa Parker Youth Safety Fund to support training and resources for churches across Tennessee, helping other congregations develop protocols to protect children from adults who might abuse positions of trust, turning tragedy into prevention. The years moved forward and Camden changed as all towns do, but those who remembered Melissa Parker kept her story alive through the scholarship fund, through the safety protocols that bore her name, and through the memorial garden planted at Riverside Baptist Church. The garden was dedicated in 2025 with pink roses that bloomed every summer, and a bronze plaque told Melissa's story briefly, honoring her memory and reminding visitors that trust must be balanced with vigilance when it comes to protecting children. Carol and Richard aged together in the house where they had raised their children, and they found a kind of peace in knowing the truth, even though the truth was painful, and they supported other families whose children were missing, offering understanding that only those who had lived through it could provide. Brian became an advocate for youth protection policies in religious organizations, speaking at conferences and training events about his sister's case, about how predators used positions of authority to access victims, and about the importance of listening when children expressed discomfort. He told audiences that Melissa had likely sensed something was wrong about Brennan, but had not known how to articulate it, had been taught to respect authority figures, especially in church contexts, and that cultural conditioning had made her vulnerable to someone who exploited her trust. Thomas Warren remained in prison at the Turney Center Industrial Complex in Olney, Tennessee, and he did not appeal his sentence, did not request any hearings, and he worked in the prison chaplain's office organizing religious materials, living quietly among inmates who knew what he had done. Child predators were not popular in prison, and Brennan had been assaulted twice in his first year, once severely enough to require hospitalization, but he survived and learned to stay invisible, moving through his days without drawing attention or making connections. He received no visitors, no letters from family or former church members, and the only correspondence he maintained was with a prison ministry organization that documented cases of clergy abuse, and Brennan participated, saying he wanted his story to serve as a warning. He wrote that positions of spiritual authority created unique vulnerabilities, that parents trusted pastors implicitly, that children were taught to obey and respect religious leaders, and that predators understood this dynamic and exploited it methodically. The case attracted attention from researchers studying clergy abuse patterns, and Brennan's history of moving from church to church following whispered concerns became a case study in how religious organizations often protected reputations over children, allowing predators to continue accessing victims. Several of Brennan's former churches were contacted by investigators and journalists, and some acknowledged they had received complaints or concerns, but had not documented them formally, had allowed Brennan to resign quietly rather than face investigation or consequences. This pattern of institutional protection was not unique to Brennan's case. and researchers found similar patterns across denominations and religions, and Melissa's story became part of a larger conversation about accountability, transparency, and the need for mandatory reporting even in religious contexts. Detective Lauren Mitchell retired in 2032 after 22 years with cold case investigations, and she had solved 43 cases during her career, bringing closure to families who had waited decades. And Melissa's case remained the one she was most proud of. On her last day, she visited Melissa's grave at Highland South Memorial Park, bringing yellow flowers to match the shirt that had solved the case. And she stood there thinking about the 13-year-old girl who had gone on a church camping trip and never came home. She thought about the yellow shirt wedged under the van seat, overlooked for decades, and about how touch DNA had survived on that fabric waiting for technology to advance enough to read its secrets, and about how one piece of evidence had changed everything. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation created a cold case database that included detailed information about evidence types and storage conditions, and they began systematically retesting fabric evidence from unsolved cases, and Melissa's case had inspired this initiative. In the first 3 years of the program, 17 cold cases were solved using DNA extracted from clothing that had been stored since the 1980s and 90s, and each solved case brought answers to a family that had been living with uncertainty, and each one honored Melissa's memory. Carol Parker's health began to decline in 2034 with heart problems and arthritis, and she moved more slowly now, relying on Richard for support, but she continued her weekly visits to the cemetery as long as she was physically able. She would sit on the bench beside Melissa's grave and talk about family news, about Brian's children who were growing up with stories about the aunt they had never met, about the scholarship recipients who were creating art and writing stories that Melissa would have loved. Richard died suddenly in 2036 from a massive stroke. He was 82 years old, and the doctors said it was quick and he did not suffer, but Carol knew his heart had been broken since 1987, and he had never fully recovered. He was buried beside Melissa at Highland South Memorial Park, and Carol stood at the graves of her daughter and her husband, and she felt the weight of being the last one standing, the keeper of memories that would die with her unless she found ways to preserve them. Brian moved his mother into his home in Atlanta after Richard's death, and Carol lived there for the final years of her life surrounded by grandchildren who asked questions about Melissa, and Carol told them stories that kept her daughter alive in memory and family history. She told them about Melissa's kindness, her love of helping younger children, her dreams of becoming a missionary, and she made sure they understood that Melissa was not just a tragedy, but a real person who had lived and had been loved deeply in return. Carol died peacefully in her sleep in March 2038 at the age of 84, 51 years after Melissa disappeared, and she was buried beside Richard and Melissa at Highland South Memorial Park, and the 3 headstones formed a family reunited in death. Brian stood at the graves after everyone else had left, looking at the names of his sister, his father, and his mother, and he thought about how one June morning in 1987 had shattered their family and shaped everything that came after. He thought about the yellow shirt that had waited 36 years to speak, about Detective Mitchell who had refused to let the case remain unsolved, about the DNA that had survived on fabric when so many other things had been lost. The impact of Melissa's case extended beyond Tennessee as churches across the country re-examined their youth protection policies, and denominational leaders acknowledged that trusting spiritual authority without accountability had enabled predators for generations, and change was necessary. Training programs were developed teaching youth workers about appropriate boundaries, teaching parents about warning signs of grooming behavior, and teaching children that it was okay to say no to adults who made them uncomfortable, even if those adults were pastors or trusted leaders. The Melissa Parker Youth Safety Fund supported these training programs, providing grants to churches and religious organizations that wanted to implement comprehensive protection policies, and by 2040, the fund had trained leaders at over 300 churches. The yellow shirt that solved Melissa's case was featured in a documentary called Hidden in Trust that aired in 2039, and it examined cases where religious leaders had abused positions of authority to harm children, and Melissa's story was the central narrative. Brian participated in the documentary, speaking about his sister and about the importance of questioning authority when children's safety was at stake, and he emphasized that faith should not require blind trust. that protecting children was more important than protecting institutions. The documentary sparked difficult conversations in religious communities about accountability and transparency, about the need for mandatory reporting of abuse allegations, even when they involved respected leaders, and about creating cultures where children felt safe speaking up. David Brennan was interviewed for the documentary from prison, and he spoke about how he had exploited his position as a youth pastor, how he had used spiritual language to gain trust while harboring darkness, and how institutional protections had allowed him to continue for years. He said churches needed to implement strict policies about adult-child interactions, needed to take seriously any complaints or concerns even when they involved respected leaders, and needed to prioritize child safety over reputation management, and his words carried weight because he spoke from experience. The documentary won awards and was used in seminary courses training future religious leaders, teaching them about the responsibility that came with spiritual authority, about the vulnerability of those they served, and about the importance of systems that prevented abuse rather than concealing it. Melissa's memorial garden at Riverside Baptist Church became a place of reflection, not just for church members but for survivors of clergy abuse from across the region, and people would visit to leave flowers, to pray, to find some measure of peace in a space that honored a victim. The church installed benches in the garden with plaques that included hotline numbers for reporting abuse and resources for survivors, acknowledging that remembering Melissa meant committing to protecting others, that her legacy should be prevention, not just commemoration. Detective Paul Hendricks, who had worked Rebecca Hayes' case in Maine, visited Tennessee in 2040 to meet with Detective Mitchell, and the two shared experiences about cold cases solved through preserved evidence and advancing DNA technology, and they spoke at a joint conference. They emphasized that evidence collected decades ago could still speak if properly stored and re-examined with modern technology, and they encouraged law enforcement agencies to inventory old evidence and prioritize testing fabric items that might contain touch DNA from suspects. The conference led to a national initiative called the Cold Case Fabric Project, funded by federal grants, and it systematically tested clothing evidence from unsolved cases across the country, and in the first 5 years, the project solved over 60 cases, bringing answers to families who had waited decades. Each solved case referenced Melissa's yellow shirt as inspiration, as proof that seemingly insignificant evidence could change everything, and families who received closure after decades sent letters to Brian thanking him for keeping Melissa's story alive, for turning tragedy into advocacy. The town of Gatlinburg erected a memorial for Melissa in 2041 at the trailhead, where the youth group had begun their hike to Abrams Falls, and the memorial included a bronze plaque with her photograph and a message about safety and vigilance. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park implemented new requirements for organized youth groups, including mandatory check-in protocols, GPS tracking for groups larger than 10 people, and enhanced training for adult leaders about supervision and appropriate boundaries with minors. These changes came too late for Melissa, but protected thousands of other children who visited the park each year with church groups, scout troops, and school organizations, and park rangers told Melissa's story during safety briefings, emphasizing that tragedy had led to reform. Brian continued his advocacy work into his 60s, and he founded a nonprofit organization called Safe Faith Communities that provided training and consulting services to religious organizations wanting to implement comprehensive child protection policies, and the organization thrived. His 3 children had grown into adults who understood the importance of their aunt's legacy, and his oldest daughter became a social worker specializing in trauma counseling for abuse survivors, carrying forward the family's commitment to protecting vulnerable people. The yellow shirt remained in its climate-controlled storage at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and it was occasionally loaned to museums and educational institutions for exhibits about forensic science, and visitors could see the actual shirt that had preserved DNA for 36 years. Each exhibit included information about Melissa's life, about her dreams and her faith, ensuring she was remembered as a person, not just evidence, and photographs showed her smiling face alongside technical explanations of touch DNA and how the case had been solved. David Brennan died in prison in August 2043 from complications of pneumonia. He was 84 years old, and there was no funeral service, no obituary, no public acknowledgement of his passing beyond a notation in prison records. His body was cremated, and his ashes disposed of according to state protocol, and the world moved on without marking his death, and his name faded from memory except as the pastor who killed Melissa Parker, the predator who had hidden behind Faith. The contrast was stark between how Melissa was remembered through memorials and scholarships and documentaries, and how Brennan disappeared without trace or tribute, and everyone who knew the story understood that was exactly how it should be. Jennifer Hayes, who had lost her sister Rebecca in Maine, reached out to Brian in 2044, and they connected over their shared experience of losing siblings to trusted authority figures, and they collaborated on presentations about recognizing and preventing abuse in institutional settings. Together they spoke at conferences for educators, coaches, youth workers, and religious leaders, and they emphasized that predators specifically sought positions of trust and authority, that background checks were necessary but not sufficient, and that creating cultures of transparency was essential. They told the stories of their sisters, of Rebecca who had hidden a diary page and of Melissa whose shirt had preserved DNA, and they emphasized that victims often tried to protect themselves, tried to leave evidence, and deserved investigators who would search diligently. The collaboration between families affected by different cases created a network of support and advocacy, and other families whose children had been harmed by authority figures joined the effort, creating a movement focused on systemic change rather than individual justice. Brian retired from his architecture practice in 2045 to focus full-time on safe faith communities, and the organization had grown to serve over 500 churches and religious institutions across 15 states, and every policy they implemented was created in Melissa's memory. He visited her grave regularly, bringing yellow roses and sitting on the bench nearby, and he talked to her about the work he was doing, about the children who were being protected because of her story, about the predators who were being stopped before they could harm. He told her about his grandchildren who were learning her story, about the scholarship students who were creating art and writing stories, about the training programs that bore her name, and he promised her that she would never be forgotten, that her legacy would continue. The story of Melissa Parker became required reading in seminary courses, in youth ministry training programs, in nonprofit management classes focused on child-serving organizations, and her case was analyzed from multiple perspectives including theology, psychology, and organizational behavior. Scholars examined how Brennan had used spiritual language to manipulate trust, how institutional protections had enabled his continued access to victims, how reporting systems had failed, and how reforms inspired by Melissa's case had created safer environments for children. The yellow shirt was featured in a permanent exhibit at the National Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C., and the exhibit called Evidence That Waited showcased items from cold cases solved through preserved evidence and advancing technology, and Melissa's shirt was the centerpiece. Visitors learned about touch DNA, about proper evidence storage, about the importance of re-examining old cases with new technology, and about the families who had waited decades for answers, and many left the exhibit determined to support cold case units and forensic advancement. Brian Parker died peacefully in his sleep in 2052 at the age of 75, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, and he had spent the final decades of his life honoring his sister's memory through advocacy and education, protecting countless children from predators. He was buried at Highland South Memorial Park beside Carol, Richard, and Melissa, and the 4 headstones formed a complete family reunited in death, and his stone included the inscription, "Devoted brother, tireless advocate, guardian of Melissa's legacy." His children continued the work of safe faith communities, and the organization expanded internationally, training religious leaders in multiple countries about child protection, and every policy manual included Melissa's photograph and story in the introduction, explaining why the work mattered. The yellow shirt that solved Melissa's case was eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution for permanent preservation in their collection of historically significant forensic evidence, and it was displayed alongside other items that had changed investigative practices and brought justice after decades. The exhibit label told Melissa's complete story, from the camping trip to the disappearance to the 36-year wait to the DNA breakthrough, and it emphasized that evidence preservation and technological advancement could bring answers when human memory and traditional investigation failed. Thousands of visitors saw the yellow shirt each year, and many were moved to donate to cold case organizations or to support legislative efforts funding forensic testing of old evidence. And Melissa's story continued to inspire action and change decades after her death. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park added a permanent marker at the Abrams Falls Trailhead in 2055, 68 years after Melissa disappeared, and the marker honored her memory while reminding hikers about the importance of staying together and supervising children on trails. The marker included a QR code that linked to information about the Melissa Parker Youth Safety Fund and Safe Faith Communities, allowing visitors to learn more and contribute to the ongoing work of protecting children in outdoor and religious settings. Riverside Baptist Church celebrated its 150th anniversary in 2056, and the commemoration included acknowledgement of Melissa's case, recognition that the church had failed to protect her, and commitment to continued vigilance and improvement in youth protection policies. The current pastor spoke about how institutions must prioritize children over reputation, must implement transparent reporting systems, must create cultures where concerns are investigated, not suppressed, and must learn from tragedies like Melissa's to prevent future harm. The memorial garden where pink roses bloomed every summer remained a place of reflection and commitment, and church members tended it carefully, ensuring it was beautiful and welcoming, ensuring Melissa's memory stayed alive through growing things and continuing care. Detective Lauren Mitchell died in 2057 at the age of 81, and her obituary highlighted her distinguished career solving cold cases and particularly her work on Melissa Parker's case, noting that her persistence had brought closure after 36 years. Her funeral was attended by dozens of families whose cases she had solved, whose missing loved ones she had found, whose questions she had answered after decades of uncertainty, and they spoke about how she had treated every case as if it were her own family, every victim as a person, not a file. The science that solved Melissa's case continued to evolve with new methods for extracting DNA from increasingly degraded materials, and cold cases from the 1950s and 60s were being solved, using techniques that would have seemed impossible when Melissa disappeared. Each breakthrough honored the families who had preserved evidence for decades, who had kept clothing and personal items hoping someday technology would advance enough to read their secrets, and each solved case proved that patience and persistence could bring justice no matter how much time had passed. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it, and if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. Because families deserve answers, and evidence deserves to be heard no matter how many years pass or how carefully secrets are hidden. Melissa Parker was 13 years old when she disappeared on a church camping trip. She loved mission work and helping younger children. She had curly black hair and a gentle spirit, and though her future was stolen by someone who claimed to serve God, her voice endured. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a catalyst for protecting children in religious settings, as proof that fabric evidence can preserve DNA for decades, as inspiration for re-examining old cases with new technology, and as a legacy that changed how institutions balance trust with accountability. Her yellow shirt captured more than her killer's DNA. It captured a moment of violence that had been hidden for 36 years. And that shirt waited patiently in evidence storage until someone looked closely enough to test it. And in the end, the truth emerged as it always does, persistent and patient, waiting in cotton fabric and skin cells for someone to listen to what it had to say. And justice came not quickly, but certainly, bringing Melissa home and ensuring her story would protect children for generations to come.